Hello. We're going to start looking at variables in our Java programming. Now, variables allow us to work with data and numbers in our programs, so they're very important. There are two kinds of variables in Java. There are primitive variables, which work with Java's primitive data types, which I'll explain later, and there are reference variables. Now, we'll leave reference variables for another video. In the meantime, let's just focus on learning about primitive variables. We know from the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy that the secret to the meaning of life and everything is 42. Say we wanted to write a program which used this bit of information, this data item, the integer value 42. To do that, we would set up a variable. Now, a variable has two components. Firstly, there is a memory location where we can place the value of 42. And the second thing we need is an identifier or a name which we can refer to that memory location by. So in this case, meaning of life is the identifier or name we have given to the memory space with the integer value in it. In Java, identifiers can be made of letters, digits, and the underscore and dollar symbols. They must, however, start with a letter, and they are case sensitive. We also can't use reserved words as identifiers. Reserved words are words which have another meaning in the Java language, so we wouldn't be able to have a variable called class, for example. By convention, primitive variables start with a lowercase letter. The memory location contains the data. In this case, we've placed the integer value 42 in that location. As I said earlier, the data placed in a primitive variable must be one of the primitive data types provided by Java. This table provides a list of primitive data types with the space used for an item of data and the range of possible values. The top four in this list are highlighted, as these are the most commonly used ones. You are less likely to need the others, which mainly date back to a time when hardware specs were more limiting, although they still have their uses. For instance, if a very large integer is needed, the long data type is available, or if memory space is an issue, short and float may be used in place of int and double. Now let's look at how we use variables in our code. Each variable needs a declaration before it is used. The declaration statement gives the data type of the variable and the identifier which will be used for it. In this case, we have instructed the compiler to put aside 32 bits of memory for an integer and call it size. Every variable must be a specific data type, and only data items of that type can be placed in a variable location. Once the space is reserved and named, we can assign a value to the variable. In other words, store a data item in the memory location. In this example, the integer 7 is assigned to the variable size. We can condense and simplify our code by declaring variables of the same type as a list, as you can see here, or by declaring and assigning a value at the same time, as in int size becomes equal to 7. We can also assign values to a variable with an expression containing other variables, provided they are of compatible data types. The last thing we need to talk about is the scope of variables. Just because a variable is declared doesn't mean it's defined and available throughout our program. For instance, a variable declared within a method is local and only available to that method. Referring to the variable outside that method would generate an error. We could even use the same word as identifiers for different variables in different methods, although that's usually not a good idea. The part of our project where a variable can be used is called the scope of that variable. We can control the scope of variables by where we declare them and also by using keywords in the declaration. A variable declared with the keyword public can be accessed from anywhere in the program. A variable declared protected can be used within the class and any subclasses it's inherited. A variable declared with the keyword private can only be used in the class it's declared in. So we've covered what variables are, primitive data types, declaring and using variables, and finally the scope of variables. With practice, you will become familiar with all these ideas.